Hello everybody, I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to cover Chapter 3 on culture. Okay, let's get started. So, the first thing we're going to cover is the idea of what culture is, where it comes from, why it's important, and really why should we care. Okay, so the idea is that humans are social creatures, social animals, that's what we are. And our survival is based on our ability to form and maintain groups. Okay, so this is key. Now, culture itself can be pretty much anything that we value, belief systems, traditions, you name it. And the thing is, there's culture all around us, and we just don't see it just because, well, we've been socialized in whatever society that we're born in, and we just, really, what it comes down to, we don't recognize aspects of our very own culture. Okay? But culture can be language, it could be, a dialect, it could be a situation where even in the United States, right? We have a large population of individuals who speak English, but English and the dialect that's spoken in California, maybe Southern California, is going to be different than Northern California. The English spoken in Southern California is going to be different than English spoken in New York, Southern states. That dialect, that difference in the way we speak English, that this one language, could indicate culture. Okay, so culture is all around us. So these beliefs, these values, the practices are created by and enforced by people who interact and share culture. And what they mean by this is we sanction one another. We essentially, what we do is we make sure that individuals within our society adhere to the beliefs, values, and practices that we believe you should be adhering to. So something along those lines. And I'll get into this, I'll get into sanctioning a little bit more later. But really, what the idea is, if you belong in a particular community, and let's say one of the moral issues or issue of morality within that community is, let's say, maybe not dating somebody who's outside your religious group, right? So they can argue that if you are, let's just say, Catholic, okay, and you've grown up Catholic, your family's Catholic, the community that you live in is predominantly Catholic, and then you decide to date somebody outside the Catholic faith. That could be, a cultural or moral violation, right? You've stepped outside what we consider to be the right thing to do. Okay, so that's just an example how, we could transgress moral or more essentially moral values or moral expectations of behavior. Okay. And society essentially is just a group of people who share a community and a culture. Describes a definable region as small as a neighborhood, a state, or a country. It's worded weird. And really what I mean by this is Southern California. Southern California is its own small, definable geographical area. Southern California is definitely not Northern California. Okay, there's differences as far as culture, differences as far as values, different as far as beliefs. I would argue, like I said, if anybody's ever spent time in Northern California, you might recognize there are differences, maybe subtle, but differences nonetheless. But let's look at even Southern California. Within Southern California, we have a lot of different regions here. We have LA County and Orange County. And I'm not sure how many of you spend time in LA County or counties outside of Orange County. And if you do, you may agree with me, you may not, but I would argue that LA County is definitely not Orange County. Okay, there's a term some of you might be familiar with called the orange curtain. The orange curtain is this idea that once you leave LA County and you pass into Orange County, you drive in, you go into this almost like a veil, like a shield. The Orange County shields its residents and its communities from outside counties. That it is different the way that we do things, and I argue to some extent that it is. I mean, Orange County for the most part is, some might disagree with me, but I'd argue just a big suburb. It's not a big. It doesn't have a huge downtown. Okay, it doesn't have, not like LA County does, or even LA City. I mean, think about it. The largest downtown area we have in Orange County is going to be what? Downtown Santa Ana. Think about the downtowns that we have. Downtown Fullerton, We don't have downtown Huntington Beach. Like, we don't have a huge downtown area. Compare our downtown areas to areas within LA County. Look at Long Beach, one of the closest cities, the bordering city, I'd argue, between Orange County and LA County. Long Beach is downtown. It's huge. It's much bigger than any downtown area that we have. And then downtown LA, completely different. So I argue Orange County is a suburb. It's a lot slower. It's a lot quieter. It's not LA County. And I would argue that is the small, definable geographical area that we can define, okay, that will have its own culture. Okay, moving forward. So what is culture? And we kind of already covered what that is. Okay, culture is simply behaviors that are not ingrained or inherent, but rather learned. Okay, and what this is going to argue is that there's nothing really inherent, for the most part, about our behavior as a human species. Most of the things that we're going to do are going to be based off of what we learn. So a good example of this would be, well, I would argue marriage. Now, marriage is a practice that I argue is not ingrained in us. We're not born and kind of programmed on a genetic level to get married. Marriage is something that we have socially constructed. Marriage is something that we have created to help ourselves, and I'd argue survive. Okay, so marriage, I'd argue, is a cultural universal, and what a cultural universal is a behavior that we see across cultures globally or universally. So marriage. Now, not all forms of marriage will be the same, but most cultures, I say almost all cultures, have some model for marriage. So it could be a situation where it could be an arranged marriage. A lot of other countries have arranged marriages. I've known people who have been in arranged marriages, some of them good, some of them bad, just like our marriages here, right? In Western society, Western culture, we argue you should marry people that you love. Love should be first and foremost. That's the requirement for marriage, okay? So in some cultures, love is what the primary reasoning for marrying somebody is. In other cultures, it's going to be stability. It could be maintaining family honor. It could be various other things that could lead to an arranged marriage, okay? But at the end of the day, it's still a marriage. Doesn't matter if it was the result of two people falling in love or two people who were arranged to be married. It's still a marriage, okay? So the culture universal, or a good example, would be marriage. It's something that we have socially created to ensure our survival, okay? Now we have the concept of normal. Well, normal is essentially being in line with mainstream values, mainstream beliefs, okay? Has nothing to do with the actual behavior in and of itself. So I would argue that most behaviors are not inherently deviant or abnormal in and of themselves. What's going to make something normal or not normal is whether or not it's accepted by society as a whole or mainstream society, okay? So example of this, using marriage. In Western society, people that get married usually get married because they fell in love with one another, right? That's the component, right? Most people that most people that I know, that are married, if you were to ask them if they married somebody or if they would marry somebody that they didn't love, I'd argue most people would argue that they love the person that they married, and that's why they married them. Now, whether or not they love them down the line, that's a whole other conversation, but initially, the reason why they got married is because they loved one another, okay? That is normal, what I would consider Western culture, okay? Now, if somebody were to live in a Western society, in Western culture, and not get married to somebody that they love, but get married to somebody that they were arranged to be married to, you might be considered that deviant or abnormal because that's not what the mainstream here argues should be the basis of marriage. So normal, not normal, is really dependent on whether or not it syncs up or it adheres to what mainstream values and beliefs are. Okay? Let's move forward. So culture consists of thoughts and tangible things. So nothing too complicated here. So material culture is just material goods, anything that we create ourselves. So anything physical that we create. So iPhones would be something we created, technology. Just think about spend all day here talking about stuff that we create. Anything that we produce ourselves. Physical objects that make up or define our culture. I'd argue that iPhones and cell phones do make up our culture. I remember a world without cell phones, and sometimes I miss that world. I don't know how many of you remember a world without cell phones. I think maybe a lot of you were born into a world where cell phones were just, part of the norm. Okay? So, material culture, objects that we use to control our environment. And we're really big on this. We love controlling our environments. And we'll get more into that in a different chapter. So, cell phones, do we use that to control our environment? I argue to a certain extent that we do. Okay? So, the example that the book's going to give as far as material culture would be books, money, clothing, and religious objects. Okay? I would agree with all of those. Those are all things that we've created. Now we're moving towards non-material culture. So non-material culture would be more abstract. And it consists of ideas, attitudes, beliefs, and beliefs of a society. So a good example of how material culture and non-material culture work together would be, let's say, religious objects. So in the previous slide, there was a picture of a crucifix. It could have been a picture of a Bible. It could have been a picture of a Quran. It could have been a picture of anything. Any kind of religious object that we've created. Now, let's just say the crucifix, right? On the previous slide, the picture of the crucifix is something that was created by us, right? It's a piece of wood, it's a piece of metal that was fabricated in the shape of a cross, okay? Now, the material, the object in and of itself really has no value, right? It's just a piece of wood and maybe a piece of metal. No value in and of itself as an object. What gives that object value is the abstract idea or the concept of religion, of what it stands for, okay? That's the value. So material objects, sometimes they may have more value than just the object in themselves, or just by themselves, I should say, and sometimes they have a huge value, significant value, based on what they symbolize. And the crucifix would be a good example of that, okay? The object itself, not valuable based on the materials itself. It's something we manufactured, but not very valuable. It's the value we place on that symbol, okay? And like I said, that goes down to, it's a belief system, right? So beliefs, religious or otherwise, values concerned with right or wrong, norms, which we'll go into a little bit later, which are just essentially guidelines for behavior, and rituals, which are essentially reaffirmation of beliefs, values, and norms. So when you go to church, or you go to, if those of you who do go to church, and for those of you who haven't, I'm sure you'll be able to follow this, when you do go to church, and my experience has been in Catholic church, when you go to church, there's a lot of rituals that you go through, right? There's the prayers, there's the kneelings, there's the handshakes, there's the entire process, body of Christ. I mean, there's a lot of things that you do repetitively, and like I said, those rituals, those behaviors reaffirm your connection with that belief system. Okay, so I hope non-material and material culture makes sense as far as how they're different and as far as how they work together. Okay, culture universals. We've kind of already covered this actually. So culture universals are patterns or traits that are globally common in all societies. And like I said before, families would be considered a culture universal. Okay, the family unit, and it doesn't matter where you go. It really doesn't. All cultures will have some model for what a family is supposed to be. Here's just some examples of individuals that are family models or family models. Okay, so the family unit, every society recognizes a family structure and regulates sexual production and care of children. And that's really what the argument is for marriage, as far as why we've socially constructed the institution of marriage. And like I said, it doesn't matter what the model is. Marriage is still a marriage. There's just a union that we have agreed to enter into, and the purpose of that union, the purpose of of marriages and these family models is really to ensure the survival of our offspring. Okay, make sure that our offspring have the best chance for survival. That's kind of the idea. So, like I said, not something that's I'd argue ingrained in us for the most part on a genetic level, but something that's been socially constructed to ensure our survival. And then there's the idea of what are some other common cultural universals. The book, I believe, argued jokes, music, laughter. There's a few other ones, but I'm not going to go into them. Okay, ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. All right. This is something that's difficult to not engage in or not participate in. Okay, so ethnocentrism, essentially the process or the act of evaluating and really judging another culture based on how it compares to one's own cultural norms. I think everybody is guilty of this. Okay, so pretty much the idea is I'm going to judge another culture as less than simply because it differs from my own. That's really what this is. The example I'm going to use is the food that we eat. Okay, we eat here in the United States. There's certain things that are acceptable as a food option, and there's things that are not acceptable as a food option. Okay, I'm going to try to keep this not too bad, because just searching for other animals in other countries and even just how animals are slaughtered is a pretty tough go on the internet. So this is probably the best example I could find. So here in the United States, I'd argue, even though people do eat horse meat, it's not something that we do normally. I personally have never eaten horse meat. I don't think I know anyone who has personally. Then again, I haven't gone around asking, but then again, nobody's actually told me about it either. So I'd argue here, if you were to ask yourselves, and this is really what I'm asking you to do, I'm asking you whether or not you would eat horse meat. So if you went into a restaurant and you sat down, would you eat horse meat? Okay, now answer that question for yourself. Some people would say yes, some people would say no. And for those of us who say no, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you eat horse meat? For me personally, and I'm going to go ahead and own up to this. For me personally, I do not see horses as a food option. Okay? I've spent time, not a lot of time, but I've spent time with horses. And horses to me are like big dogs. Very intelligent. Very, for my opinion, amazing animals. And because my experience with horses was not a situation where they were on the menu for dinner, I essentially built up this belief, this ideal that horses are not a food option. Okay? But just because horses are not a food option for me doesn't mean that they're not a food option for somebody else. Now, the little image there tells us that horse meat in Europe is actually a pretty big thing. There's a lot of other countries that do eat horse meat, and there is horse meat served here in the United States. People do eat horse meat here, along with a lot of other things. But that's the idea, right? The idea is that you would judge another culture as less than, you would criticize or be critical of another culture for their food options. Like for me, I don't think horses should be on the menu. Okay? But then again, you can look at other countries, and as far as cows. We eat a lot of cattle. So, are there countries in this world where cattle or cows are off the menu? There definitely is. Depending on your cultural beliefs, it may determine or dictate what you can and cannot eat. And the idea is we would judge other countries based on that, or other cultures based on that. Okay? So, animals that we eat is a pretty good idea, or a pretty good way of judging your ethnocentrism, right? What you will and will not eat. Now, the question is it possible not to be ethnocentric? I'd argue it's not. It's not possible not to be ethnocentric. I think that's kind of biases that we have kind of built in. But I think what we should do is try to acknowledge our ethnocentrism when it's there. Okay, when it arises. Essentially the idea is that by acknowledging it, you attempt to minimize it. Okay, and that's, I'd argue, the best that we can do. Oops, pause. All right, cultural imperialism. So, cultural imperialism is the deliberate imposition of one's own cultural values on another culture. So, on the previous side, we have ethnocentrism, which is the belief that the 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 way that we do things in, let's just say, the United States is the best way to do things, right? And we're going to judge other countries or other cultures as less than because they failed to do it that way. Cultural imperialism steps that up a notch, and what cultural imperialism does is takes ethnocentrism and then essentially applies that belief, that prejudice towards other groups, and essentially saying because the way we do things is the best way, we're going to go ahead and encourage you or slash force you to do things our way because we feel that is the best way to do things. Okay, so there's a lot of countries, and most powerful countries, most world powers, I'd argue, are guilty of doing this, um, essentially exerting their will on weaker nations. And the idea is that might makes right. So if you have the ability to exert your will as a country on a weaker country, a lot more often than not, that's exactly what happens. The United States is no exception. Okay, so cultural imperialism, the deliberate imposition of one's own cultural values on another culture. We've seen that here in this own country. I mean, a good example of that, not to get too far into it, would be the treatment of Native Americans. Essentially, it was a campaign of removal, genocide, and then once the war was won, if you will, Native Americans that were left were forced to no longer speak their native tongues, were forced to cut their hair, were forced to wear clothes, were forced to convert to a religion that was not their own. So essentially, they were forced to comply with a much more powerful government or institution, I would say. So the United States imposed an entire way of life on a people who did not want it. That would be an example of cultural imperialism. We've seen this, around the world, South Africa. So any powerful country that's, practice colonialism, imperialism. Okay, and then there's the idea of culture shock. So ethnocentrism can be so intense that it can lead to disorientation and frustration when confronted with a differing culture. So really what this is the idea that you feel out of place. And out of place at such a level where it completely disorients you, right? It's almost stifling, the differences of another culture. I guess an argument for that, well, we can go ahead and stick with the same, argument for food. It's the idea that, if you go to another country, the food options there may be so different than from what you're used to that, you're shocked by it, or it could be the idea of, for some of you who've ever traveled or been someplace where, you didn't speak the language, that's going to be disorienting. If you've ever been to a country where it's like my example, right? English speaking. So if I go to a country that's non-English speaking, I could be disoriented. I'm going to look around. I'm not going to be able to navigate. I'm not going to be able to read signs. I'm not going to be able to talk to people. I'm going to be definitely the odd man out, and that would be an example of culture shock. Okay. All right. Elements of culture continued. We're going to talk about values. So an important value system here, well, let's just say what values are, right? So values are a culture's standard for discerning what is good and just within a society, okay? And they're embedded and critical for transmitting and teaching cultural beliefs or culture's beliefs. So the idea is let's just go ahead and talk about this for a moment. The first agent of socialization. So our first lesson in socialization takes place at the hands of our parents. Our parents socialize us first. So the families that we're born into are the first group of people that we're going to encounter that are going to socialize us. And they're going to essentially teach us everything we need to learn, or at least provide us with the base for the things that we need to learn or to function in the society that we're now a part of. Okay, and part of that is going to be the value or value systems. Okay, so in the United States, a good example of a value system would be individualism. There are other ones, but individualism is a fantastic example of a value system here in the U.S. Okay, and really what this argues is that we're taught in America that we should be individuals. Okay, we should be trailblazers. We should we shouldn't be sheep. We should want to march to the beat of our own drum. Okay, there's value in that. There's value placed on people being unique. Self-sufficient is also something that we value. The ability to pick yourself up by the bootstraps, become successful all on your own without the help of others. You want to be independent. Okay, autonomous. Which means that essentially you're free from the influence of others. Okay, this is what I would argue would be a very American value, being the individual. Okay, we're not really focused on the collective here. We're really focused on just us, my way. Okay, and this kind of ties into the whole American dream. Okay, so an ideal culture would be those values and how they suggest that individuals should behave. Okay, so because it is an ideal culture, it would be or would not be a reflection of what reality is, but it's still something that we strive for. So we have value systems, which is, like I said, one example would be individualism. Then we have ideal culture, which is a value that suggests how individuals should behave, how we should act, or what we should want. Okay, and in the United States, I believe a very good example of this, as far as belief systems, value systems, would be the American dream. Okay. And what the American dream isn't so much a dollar amount, but it is a lifestyle. So I'd argue for most Americans, myself included, I'm personally in chasing the American dream. Okay, I have no delusions of grandeur. I don't believe that I'm ever going to be wealthy or rich. That's not me. It's not what's going to happen. That wasn't something I was going to do. Okay, I'm not particularly innovative or creative, so I'm not going to invent something that's going to make me millions. But what I hope to do is scratch out a life in the middle class. And what the middle class is a very comfortable life. Okay, and that is what I argue the American dream is. The American dream is a middle class life, and this is an ideal, right? And the reason why it's an ideal is because, the reason why it's an ideal is because we've been taught that as long as you work hard, as long as you jump through the hoops, you go to school, you go to college, right? You get out, you get a job, you work hard, you save money, you do all the right things. Essentially, you achieve the American dream, that goal, through legitimate means, right? You're not going to go out and be a criminal or cheat or steal. You're going to go ahead and get your American dream, your middle class life, through hard work. Okay, and this is a value system. This is a belief system that as long as you work hard, you'll be successful. Okay, and the reason why I would consider this to be an ideal, and the issue with the ideal, right, is that it's not a reflection of reality. For the most part, to some extent, I should say, because the idea is that just because you work hard, just because you went to school, just because you have a college degree, does that guarantee you a position within the middle class? And the answer to that would be no. But what makes that American dream such a creative ideal or such an amazing belief system is the way that it sets itself up. If you're successful and you achieve the American dream through hard work and all those things, then you deserve it, right? The reason why you're successful is because of your hard work. You deserve it. And if you're not successful achieving your American dream, then the burden lies with you. It's your fault. The idea is that you're not successful because you didn't work hard enough. So it's one of those deals where if you haven't reached your goal yet, just keep working hard. And if you have reached it, well, you reached it because you worked hard. It's one of those deals where it doesn't provide an answer to those who haven't reached the American dream, who do work hard. Because the argument is, the failsafe is that you're just not working hard enough. Okay, and that's an ideal, or at least in my opinion. I would argue that the American dream is an ideal. Okay, it's an ideal because it's not a reflection of reality, because the reality is not everybody can be middle class. Okay. All right, and we've already talked about this, so I'm going to go ahead and skip that, right? The American dream. Anybody willing to work hard enough will be successful and wealthy. Not necessarily. All right, so this section here is going to probably be the most important section of this chapter. I'm going to be spending quite a bit of time talking about this because I do find it very, very important. Okay, so sanctions. Maintaining values through social control. That's what we do. So values of a society, like we've talked about already, are maintained through rewards, sanctions, and punishments. Okay? And a sanction is a form of social control. And we are constantly sanctioning for behavior that we want or don't want. You know, with family, friends, loved ones, at school, work, you name it. Our society is constantly sanctioning one another, and you've seen this on videos on YouTube, and the whole issue with I believe the term is Karens and Kevins, individuals within our society who try to sanction others for behavior they find wrong. That's what's happening here. That's what that is. People sanctioning other people for behaviors, whether they want them to stop, want them to keep going, either for or against. Okay, the sanction is a form of social control, and we sanction for behaviors by giving support, approval, or permission, or essentially punishment, instilling formal sanctions of disapproval and non-support. It is a way to encourage conformity to cultural norms. Those who go against society's values are punished. So whatever society you're born into, this kind of goes back to the whole idea of the concept of your family being the first agent of socialization that we encounter when we're born, or as on our journey. Your family is going to teach you what's acceptable and not acceptable as far as behavior, and your family will sanction you for behavior that they find or that they value or appreciate or approve of and disapprove of. And we see this constantly. If you ever spend time around little kids, if you have little kids yourselves or spend time around little kids, we are constantly sanctioning little kids. And the reason why we sanction little kids is because we want them to grow up and be able to function well in society. So when little kids are not sharing, right? You got little kids got some a toy or food, candy, what have you, and that little kid doesn't want to share, and there's other little kids asking for it, usually you'll see the parent tell their child, you have to learn how to share, you have to be nice, you have to do this, you have to do that, because it's the nice thing to do. It's the right thing to do. And when little kids behave in a way that we approve of, we reward them, okay? If you are nice and polite and you behave, you'll get something. So we reward behavior that we approve of, and if the kid misbehaves, then we'll punish them. That is sanctioning. And we do it to little kids, and we do it to adults. We sanction each other constantly. Okay, and there's different forms or different levels of sanctioning. And this is where we're really going to have to start. This is really where I really want you to focus on, are these three different types of sanctions. So norms essentially govern our lives through implicit and explicit guidance on what to think, believe, how to behave, and how to interact with others. So norms set their standard. So it doesn't matter what society you were born in, there are norms, and those norms are going to dictate what good behavior is and what bad behavior is. Okay, what we will sanction for positively and what we will sanction for negatively. Okay, they are essentially prescribed rules of conduct. Okay, so the first norm, or the first form of sanction we're going to go and cover will be folkways. Okay, so folkways are basic expectations of behavior expected of a culture. And really, when you think of folkways, what I want you to think of is minding your manners. Okay, so by being polite and minding your manners in society, what that does for you and for me is ensure that life runs smoothly. Okay, so an example of this would be I'm trying to think of a good example of this. All right, let's think about it. Southern California, huge car culture here, right? I'm sure everybody here drives, everybody's been in a car, everybody here has to commute. So when you're driving on the road or you're driving on the freeway, let's just look at the freeway, right? Or road, doesn't matter. So when you're driving, if somebody turns their blinker on, okay, what are they doing? They're indicating that they want to change lanes, okay? They turn on their blinker, let you know they want to change lanes. What do? Okay, so now here's two people in two different cars, right? The person in front has put their blinker on, indicating they want to change lanes. If I'm a polite person, right, folkways, if I'm a polite person, what I'll do is I'll let out the gas, right, and let that person, change lanes or merge into my lane, all right? That's the polite thing to do, okay? So the person put their blinker on. That was nice of them. That was very safe of them. They, acknowledge a folkway. They're going to be polite and use that blinker. I'm going to be polite and not speed up, because I don't want this car in front of me. I'm going to slow down. Maybe I might even signal to them, right? Maybe they turn their blinker on. I can see them looking at me, and I signal, and they move over. Folkways. You're polite. I'm polite. You're respectful. I'm respectful. And what happens? Life runs smoothly. Now, let's say I'm driving and you're in the front of me in the next lane and you want to change lanes and you don't use your blinker and you just kind of shoot over into my lane. That's rude. Also unsafe, and it could upset me, right? And what do? And think about this. Ask yourselves, what do you do when you're driving around? When somebody comes into your lane without using a blinker, somebody cuts you off, somebody brake checks you, somebody does something like this on the road. What happens? You get upset, then you may do something to that person, flash your brights at them, make a hand gesture. You've decided not to be polite anymore. Okay, so folkway violations are going to be violations of what we can expect or what we consider to be polite or rude behavior within our society. And this is going to be something that we have been brought up, socialized to do. Okay, there's certain ways to talk to people that would be considered polite and impolite. Certain gestures that would be considered polite and impolite. There's just certain things we don't do, and we've been taught that we shouldn't do them. Now, a lot of these things inherently aren't right or wrong or good or bad. They're right or wrong or good or bad because we, as a society, have made them so. Okay? So it's like if I'm walking through a door, right? So I open a door. I'm walking into a building. I open the door. Okay? Most people, what they'll do is when they open that door, they'll look behind them to see if there's anybody else walking in behind them so they can hold that door open for that person. That is polite. In our society, in our culture, we've been taught that it's polite to hold doors open for people that are behind you. Okay? But what happens if that person's too far away? How long do you stay there holding that door open, right? But what happens if you hold the door open? Like, I find it annoying sometimes when I'm walking up to a building and there's somebody in front of me, but they're a good distance away, and they open the door to walk in, but they stand there holding the door. So now I feel obligated to do what? Like, walk faster to get to the door so I'm not inconveniencing somebody who's trying to, be polite to me. Those are folkways, okay? It's that pressure. I might be a crazy person, but have you guys not done that where you've walked into a building or walked up to a building and somebody holds it open for you and you're far away and you feel like now you have to rush to get to the door because you don't want that person to be inconvenienced because they're being nice and holding the door open for you? You're going to be nice and rush so that you're not slowing down their day. That feeling that you have to rush to the door, that's society. That feeling that you have to hold the door open for somebody, that is society. That is a norm. That is what we have been taught. Okay? So folkway violations are essentially based on, or the goal is to provide a smooth life. Okay. Now the problem with folkway violations is our ability to sanction them. Okay. So if somebody doesn't hold the door open for you as you're walking right behind them, we'd argue that was rude, right? You're walking to the door, they open it right before you do, and they let the door close on you as you're walking right up on it. Okay? That's rude because we've been taught that is rude. But what do? If somebody doesn't hold the door open for you, what are you going to do? You're going to say something to them? How would you sanction somebody who's rude to you? You could say something to them, but what is that going to do? Have you ever tried to sanction somebody and somebody who was a stranger? And this is a very important component to norms, okay, and in the society that we live in. I probably should have started with this, okay? In the world we live in today, we are strangers to one another, okay? Orange County, what is it? 300 and, God, what's the population here in Orange County? 400,000 people, 500,000 people, God, I don't know. I think it's like around 350 to 400,000. I'm not 100% sure what the population is. But what I can tell you is there are a lot of people in Orange County. And those people are pretty much strangers. Think about it, when we're, back on campus. How many people do you actually know on campus? Your classmates. When you're in a classroom, face to face. Think about it. Even though we're face to face, even though we engage with one another at school, are we still not strangers to one another? We are. Think about people you work with. You're strangers to one another to a certain extent. Okay? And that's the way this world works. That's the world that we live in now. We live in a world where we are strangers to one another. Okay? And it is very difficult to sanction for folkway violations, rude or polite behavior, when we're strangers. Okay? Now, I guess a good example of this would be violating a folkway expectation norm. So a folkway violation can be easily sanctioned by friends, family, and loved ones. So the idea is if you behave in a way that's rude or not polite, your parents could sanction you effectively because they're your parents. They're significant to you. Your friends could sanction you for behavior that would be considered rude or polite because they're your friends. They're significant individuals to you. Okay, same thing with maybe a partner, significant other. Your girlfriend, your boyfriend could sanction you for behavior that was rude because they're significant to you. Okay, and think about that. Think about the people that you listen to in your lives. When you do something wrong and somebody's going to correct your behavior, who in your life do you allow that, or who in your life has the ability to do that? Okay? And whoever that person is, whatever the answer to that question is, that person is significant to you. Okay? But in the world we live in today, there's very few people that are significant to us. Okay? And that's just the reality of living in a post-industrial or society. So pre-industrial societies were societies before the Industrial Revolution, and life was very different. Life back then took place on essentially on a rural agrarian system, which means that you lived on farms, you lived in these small communities. Now, within small communities, you knew everybody. It'd be like living in an Amish community. I think that may be a good example of that. Everybody here is familiar with who the Amish are. They live in small communities. It's rural and agrarian. Everybody has the same religion, the same value system, the same beliefs. They dress the same. So essentially, everybody there is very tight-knit and therefore able to sanction one another in a significant way, okay, because of that closeness. Today's society, we're way too different from one another. Way too different. Different religious views, different upbringings, cultural beliefs, you name it. Just think about how diverse Southern California is, okay? That diversity also creates a situation, at least in my opinion, where we are separated from one another in a way where it makes it very difficult for us to sanction effectively. And think about it. If you're out and about and somebody tries to sanction you, say, I don't know, I'm trying to think of something. Let's say you litter, right? You throw a bubblegum wrapper on the ground, okay? And a stranger looks at you and tells you, hey, you're going to pick that up? Ask yourself, would you pick it up? Some of you might pick it up, and some of you might not. Some of you might think, well, who is this person to tell me anything? You're a stranger to me. Why should I do what you're asking me to do? Why should I allow you to sanction my behavior? You're a stranger. Now, same question. If it was your mom, your dad, or somebody that's significant to you, would you be more inclined to pick up that little piece of paper that you dropped? And however you answer that question will determine who's significant to you and who's not. Okay. So folkway violations are essentially based on rude and polite behavior. They do exert a form of social pressure to act, but it is very difficult to sanction for folkway violations. And this is a very important part of folkways. There's no moral significance to the behavior or violation for folkways. There's nothing morally wrong with not holding the door open for somebody. There's nothing morally wrong with dropping a piece of paper on the ground. Okay, we're going to argue that those are not issues of morality. Okay, I'm not going to argue that just because somebody doesn't hold the door open for me, that person's a morally corrupt individual. Okay, it doesn't go that far. It doesn't extend that far. Okay, there's not polite. Somebody cannot be polite and still be moral, I'd argue. So that is a very important distinction between folkways and the other types of norms that we're going to be covering. So, because there's no moral significance, it's very difficult to sanction in a very significant or meaningful way. Okay. All right. Moving forward, the next norm will be mores. Okay. Now, mores are based off of issues or I'm going to say issues, but essentially based off morality or gauges of morality. Okay. So moral judgments that include rewards and punishments, they definitely do, are definitely much more strict, or can be, they are stricter than folkways and determine moral and ethical behavior. Okay, so mores are concerned with behavior that is right and wrong on the ethical level, where folkways were not. Okay, and they do exact a greater course of force in shaping values, beliefs, behavior, and interactions. And really, what I mean by this is, where folkways, you could try to sanction somebody, but it really depends the effectiveness of your sanctioning will depend on how significant you are to that person. Okay, and there's, like I said, no moral component. Mores, that is different. Okay, so an example of a more violation would be violating some kind of religious doctrine or value system or belief system. So if you're particularly a religious individual, you may understand what I'm talking about. Okay. So example I'll use would be, let's say cohabitation. Okay, cohabitation is the practice of living with a partner that you are not married to. Okay, so you're living with a boyfriend, you're living with a girlfriend, but the idea is you're living under one roof and you're not married. Okay, now there is nothing inherently wrong about cohabitating. Okay, nothing wrong with that. What makes it wrong is us. So depending on what culture you belong to, what kind of your belief systems are, cohabitation is something that is, as far as something that's wrong, would be socially constructed. So ask yourselves, and it depends. It depends on the families that you were born into and what their value systems are. But just ask yourselves, if you went home today and you told your parents that you were going to be moving in with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, how would they feel? Okay. Would they be happy about it? Would they be upset? Okay. If they were upset, why would they be upset? And I'd argue some families who would be upset would argue that it is morally wrong to live with somebody when you're not married. Okay. Nothing inherently wrong about this. It has been this practice of cohabitation has been socially constructed to be viewed as wrong depending on what culture you belong to. Okay, so that's a good example, at least in my opinion, of a more violation. Okay, you have essentially done something or engaging in certain behavior that is considered wrong or unethical. Okay, much different from folkways. And the punishments to this can be much, much more severe. Okay, uh, just examples of this, at least in my personal experience. I'm not sure if you guys have ever experienced anything like this. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. I've had friends that have decided they were going to go ahead and move in with their significant others. Okay, they're going to move out of their familial house, so essentially moving out of their parents' house and going to be moving in with their significant others. And parents lost it because this was a sin. You're living in sin. This is the wrong thing to do. And we're going to sanction you. Okay, sanction you seriously. Not just folkway violations where you can just say, hey, you're being rude for not holding the door open for me. No, for moray violations, the sanctioning can be severe. And for my friends, it was pretty severe. I had friends whose families essentially cut them off or threatened to cut them off. And the idea was, if you want to go ahead and move in with your partner, you can do that. But we're going to go ahead and stop paying for school. We're going to go ahead and stop paying car payments. We're going to go ahead and stop helping out with your car insurance. We're going to essentially cut you off financially if you choose to go ahead and do this. So there's a financial aspect of it, which is a form of sanctioning against the behavior of cohabitation. And then there's also the moral component, where the family will view them as somebody who's maybe potentially morally corrupt, unethical. So those two forms of sanctioning. We're going to financially sanction you by cutting you off, and we're going to go ahead and judge you. And I've had actually students tell me that their families have done similar things. I had one student who told me that their family essentially disowned them. And not only did they disown them, they told their siblings and other relatives not to have any kind of contact with them. So the student told me flat out they didn't talk to their siblings for I think 3 or 4 years because they decided to move out and cohabitate. That would be a very serious sanction, to be cut off financially and to be essentially disconnected from your family. Okay, so mores do carry a much, or can carry a much more significant punishment. Okay, and like I said, we kind of already covered these. Okay, and the last norm we're going to cover will be laws. Okay, now not much going on here. It's pretty straightforward. So essentially, laws are formal, or a type of form of formal social control. My apologies. And what this means is this is behavior that's going to be enforced by government agents. This is essentially codified expectations of behavior. And what I mean by this is it's going to be state-sponsored or state-controlled expectations of behavior. So essentially the idea is we're going to go ahead and create laws and ordinances that you have to follow. Okay, and this is going to be very different than folkways and mores. And the difference between laws and folkways and mores, if folkways and mores worked very well in pre-industrial society, at least in my opinion, because of the way society worked before the Industrial Revolutions. Much smaller communities, much easier to sanction individuals, okay? And essentially handle everything kind of in-house, in the sense that, let's say, like if you lived in an Amish community, folkways, much easier to enforce. Mores, much easier to enforce because everybody knew everybody else. Everybody was significant. Okay? And the world we live in today, like I told you guys before, we're all strangers to one another. So you will have a very difficult time sanctioning me, just like I would have a very difficult time sanctioning you for folkways and mores, because our folkways and mores will be different from one another based on how we were brought up. Okay, so in order to keep society moving forward and falling into chaos, what has happened is state and the government has decided to create laws or essentially formal social control that everybody has to follow, regardless of what your cultural background is, what your belief systems are as far as rude or polite behavior. So it doesn't matter what your folkway beliefs are or guidelines are, or your moray violation or moray guidelines are. Laws, lack of return, will trump all that. Okay, so laws are formal social control. Like I said, they're being enforced by government agents. This is law enforcement. This is going to be cities pretty much coming in and telling you what you can and cannot do based, with your vehicles, your houses, what have you. So this is just codified expectations of behavior. Okay. So like I said, not a lot going on there. Pretty straightforward. All right. Symbols, language. Let's see. I think I kind of covered this already. Yeah, this is something I think I already covered with symbolic interactions, but I've got to run through it real quick. So symbols are just gestures, signs, objects. So essentially our world is made up of symbols, and the meanings in those symbols are going to dictate how we operate or how we function. And individuals who are properly socialized are able to read the gestures, the signs, the objects, the signals, and understand the words that help us build our world. And if you're not a properly socialized individual, you would not have been taught to read all these gestures, language, symbols, objects, and therefore you'd have a hard time functioning in our world. Okay. And language is just essentially a type of gesture. Okay, because I'm not going to spend too much time. Let's already cover this. All right, high culture. All right, well, high culture is pretty. It's abstract. Okay, so high culture would be a type of cultural pattern or behavior that excludes people based off of access to money or access to wealth. So high culture or anything would be considered high culture would be exclusionary. So essentially it would exclude individuals who are not wealthy. So if the behavior or the act itself requires money, status, prestige in order to partake or be part of, then it would be considered high culture. And the book gives examples. I think it was like attending a ballet, sing a play, or listening to a live symphony as examples of high culture. So we can argue about whether or not those things would be considered high culture. Okay. Attending a ballet, a play, listening to live symphonies. The argument is if you didn't grow up in a society of high culture, you would not have been exposed to those things, at least at the level that individuals with money would have. Okay, that's kind of the idea. Attending a ballet, depending on where you're going to, that could be expensive. Symphonies, plays, those things are all expensive. I'd argue now even seeing a musical might be considered high culture, right? Depending on where you're going. I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Pantages Theater. I don't know if any of you has ever been to a musical, but tickets for those are not cheap. If you want to sit closer to the stage in the front, talking, depending on what show it is, you're looking at $200, $300, $400, $500, $600, depending on, the night and the time and the play. If you want to sit on the mezzanine section, which is the balcony in the front of the balcony with an unobstructed view, you could be talking, like I said, $500, $600 for just one ticket. So at that point, the price of the ticket maybe originally was only $100, but the demand drives that price up. And when the price goes up, it excludes individuals or excludes people or certain groups of people from, enjoying or partaking in that event. So I'd argue that it's a fluid concept, high culture, or what is considered high culture could be very fluid. Okay, like I said, but really what it is you have to ask yourself, do I have access to this? Yes or no? And why do I not have access to this? If I don't have access to this because I don't have the money, high culture. If I don't have access to this because I don't come from a particular group in society that has status, then that is high culture. Okay. The painting on the bottom here. Ask yourselves, who's the painter? Whose painting is this? If you don't know whose painting this is, don't feel bad. I didn't either. This is a Jackson Pollock painting. Okay. I didn't grow up knowing famous painters. That wasn't something I did growing up. It wasn't something I was exposed to. The only reason why I know who this painting is because I actively searched for it for this class. This is a Jackson Pollock painting. This painting is probably worth probably $100 million. Okay. So, art, high culture. Okay. Next would be pop culture. Pop culture is just anything that I'd argue, or the author would argue, majority of people in society have access to. So, access based on or through television, radio, internet. I mean, if you have access to the internet, there's pretty much nothing you don't have access to for the most part. So, if it's something you can access that way, it would be considered pop culture, right? Anything that's mainstream would be pop culture, right? So the book gives examples of parades, baseball games, television shows. I think it's a little outdated. Was often expressed and spread via commercial media such as radio, television, movies, and music industry, and really just internet. Would be the main industry now, honestly. And pop culture is accessible to most people. Okay, so most people will have access to the internet. Like I said, if you have access to the internet, what I mean by access, I'm not saying some people might not be able to afford internet in their homes, but you can go to a library. I mean, if it's pre-COVID-19 days, you can go to a library and use a public library, free internet, free books, free. You have access to all those things, and if you can get access to it that way, it would be considered pop culture. Okay, and like I said, labels can change over time. Things that we might have access to at one point in time, we might not have access to later, and vice versa. And pop culture and high culture can change.